Welcome back to another video. Today we're just doing a beginner's guide to choosing a film stock for those of you new to film photography. And we're just going to kind of go through a bunch of different styles and stocks and see what might work best for you and maybe what should you start out with, those sort of questions, and tips and tricks along the way. For any of you more advanced shooters of film that just want more out of it, there's a couple tips in this video as well, so make sure to stick around for that. So first up on the list is going to be Kodak Gold. This is a fan favorite. It's cheap, it's reliable, it's great. It's a 200 ISO film. It's on the cheaper end of the spectrum as far as film stocks go. It's got nice punchy saturated colors, fairly low grain. It comes in 120 now, which I haven't personally tried. I'm just a 35mm shooter. For any of you newcomers brand new to film, 120 is just a different side from 35mm. So your regular 35mm SLR, that's what these are going to go for. Anything other than that, like a medium format, that's what 120 means, is for medium format. It's a different size film. Most of you coming new to film, you're going to probably be just using 35mm, so that's what we're sticking with today. Next up on the list is going to be the step up, and actually one of my personal favorites, Kodak Ultramax. This stuff has very contrasted reviews as far as like people either love it or hate it. Personally, I'm on the side that loves it. It's actually one of my favorites. I love the blues and greens you get out of this film stock. It's a 400 speed film. It's a little bit faster than your Kodak Gold. It's gonna be more versatile. Personally, I like to rate it at 200 ISO instead of 400 ISO. I find what that does is when I shoot this at 400 ISO and it's a little underexposed, it gets really muddy. So the photos tend to look a little too grainy, a little too muddy. They don't look the greatest. However, I've been shooting this at 200 and I absolutely love the results. It's like a night and day difference between the film. So for those of you new to film, what I'd recommend is to rate this at 200 ISO and go from there. Anybody with an SLR like this, you can. So usually at the top when you choose your ISO, instead of going to 400 like it says on the box, do one stop overexposed for Kodak Ultramax, and I guarantee you'll like the results a lot better. It is a punchy, contrasty film. That being said, don't be afraid to shoot it at 400 if you're in good enough light. I just find backlit situations or lower light situations, I actually tend to want to overexpose and give it more light than it needs. It's a very punchy, contrasty film. It's not as warm as your Gold 200, but it just renders things a little more natural, a little more true to life. Some people say it's a boring film because the colors just kind of look normal. There's no real flair to it, but I kind of like that. I love it. So if you're shooting anything blue by water, which I kind of do in the summertime a lot, that's my go-to film. Next up, we're going to go into the more professional side of films, and we're going to be starting off with Kodak Ektar 100. This film, personally, I have a love-hate relationship with. The colors when you hit it is insane. It's a super high contrast, super high saturated film. It's going to be closer to slide film as far as your contrast and your overall latitude, saturation of the colors compared to another sort of negative film. Extremely fine grain, and when it hits, it's a beautiful film stock. I absolutely love it. There's other times though where the color shifts you get from this film are a little bit too weird and hard to scan sometimes. Sometimes there's like a red bias. Sometimes the skies on a blue, like a bluebird sky day, is gonna be almost a little bit more cyan. So it's a little harder to scan sometimes if you don't nail it. It doesn't have the exposure latitude as other negative films, so I would say rate this one at box speed, so rate it at 100 ISO. If you have a point and shoot camera, you can't. It's kind of got a DX code on it, so it'll just go to automatically to whatever the box speed is for each film. Anybody with an SLR that you can manually change the ISO like this, just rate it at 100, rate it at box speed, and you're good to go. Next up, we're going to go into a fan favorite. We're going to go into the Portra line from Kodak. And we're starting off with Portra 160. So 160 is a low ISO, low grain, low saturation, but it renders skin tones beautifully, hence the name Portra. So anybody, if you're shooting any sort of studio work, portraits, anything like that with a lot of good light, it's going to be a beautiful film for you. Some of my favorite shots have been taken on Portra, and not portraits, oddly enough, but landscapes. I found sometimes in high contrast scenes, that extra low saturation and that extra little bit of cleanliness to the film really helped out in some certain situations where like the light was a little too harsh or everything was just overblown saturated. It kind of just helps to tone it down and gets a really, really nice look to it. If you're looking for more muted colors and a little bit more subdued colors, softer tones, that sort of look, Portra 160 is going to be your best bet. So with Portra 160, you want to rate it at 160, maybe 100. You don't really want to overexpose it too much. Colors tend to shift a little bit and get either too saturated, or they can shift a little more, like the reds kind of pop out a little bit more. So I just kind of usually rate Portra 160 around 160 or maybe 100 if I want to give it that little bit of extra light. Stepping up from that, we have basically the most popular film stock in the world, and rightly so, Portra 400. It's also one of the most expensive films. So here in Canada, you're about $16 for Kodak Gold, $17, $18 for Kodak Ultramax. Portra 160, you're about $26, and then Portra 400, you're like $28, $29 sort of thing. It's expensive. It's an absolutely beautiful film, though. This contrast and color saturation is kind of in the middle, so it's a little more contrasty and a little bit more punchy than your Portra 160. It does have a little bit more grain, but it's very, very low. Like, it's not really noticeable. It's got insane exposure latitude, so it's going to be the most forgiving film of this whole bunch. If you're shooting in low light, high contrast, low contrast, like it's not the be all and end all of film, but it is going to be highly, highly rated for a very versatile film. So if you just want one film to kind of throw in your camera and you can tweak and scan to your heart's content after to get different looks, it's hard not to recommend Portra 400. As far as rating Portra 400 goes, a lot of people rate it a stop overexposed. So instead of rating it at 400, you're going to rate it at 200 and give it a little bit extra light. A lot of people will do this to get that soft pastel look and a little bit, take out the color saturation a little bit. I tend to find it shifts a little bit too much on the yellow side for me. Keeping it at 400 will give you more neutral, more natural colors, more punch and a little bit more saturation. So if you're not looking for that super pastel look and light airy look that everyone seems to kind of be after with film, it's what makes Portra 400 so great. You can get just different looks out of it depending on what you do. Stepping up from that, and probably the most expensive film of the bunch, Portra 800. This stuff is pure magic if you can afford it. I would love to be able to shoot this stuff all the time. It can be $35 a roll depending on where you buy it from. It's an absolutely beautiful film. It's a little bit more grainy than your 400, a little bit more punchy than your 400 as far as color saturation and like contrast goes. The look you get from Portra 800 is just something on its own, though. I tend to rate it at 400 ISO. I don't really see it as an 800 ISO film. Anytime I've shot it at 800 ISO, it's a little bit too muddy. And I find the colors you get out of it, the contrast, the punch, everything just looks so good at 400. So I would highly recommend, if you're going to have Portra 800, shoot it at 400. You won't regret it. That being said, if you need to shoot it at 800, don't hesitate. Just make sure you meter correctly and meter for the shadows. Of all the three Portras, it took me the longest to test out 800, and I don't know why. I did it one day, and it's probably my favorite film, like, of all. It's so expensive nowadays, so I kind of shoot sparingly. I'd rather shoot Portra 400 at 400, and it's going to be on par with, it's going to have less noise than the 800. but the colors and contrast are not quite there. So now, as far as rating films go, why would you do it with some films and not others? It's all just personal preference and testing. So I've tested a lot of rolls of film. I've ran through a lot of rolls of film to figure out what works best for me. Certain films like Portra 400, Kodak Ultramax, Portra 800, I like to do a little bit on the overexposure side, just give it that little bit more light. They can all accept it, and they're all very good at doing it. They're not going to shift too much. With any negative film, you always want to err on the side of overexposure. So as opposed to digital, where you can bring up shadows and you can kind of pull things out of the darks really easily, things don't work as well. It's kind of the opposite with negative film. So if you underexpose negative film, your shots are going to look pretty muddy, not the greatest, a little bit like hazy, I guess you'd call it, but just not pretty. So always err on the side of overexposure. If you want to play it safe, give it a half a stop to a stop overexposure. As far as dynamic range goes, it's going to be more than fine to be able to handle it. They're not going to get overblown or blow out the highlights like it would with digital. Film has a huge latitude as far as within the highlights that it goes. So now that we've kind of gone through all the films and know which films do what, recommendations, which ones would you choose, when would you choose them, sort of thing. Obviously, if you're in a low light situation, you're going to want a higher ISO film. So something in the Portra 400 or Portra 800 side of things is going to be your best bet, just to get you a fast enough shutter speed. If you want punchy, contrasty colors, something like Kodak Ultramax, Ektar 100 is hard to beat as far as that goes. And Portra 800 also kind of holds its own as far as the contrast and punchy saturation. If you're more into the portraits, I would say just stick with the Portra line of things. I wouldn't shoot portraits with Ektar. Sometimes the skin tones can go a little bit red. If you scan everything yourself, you can bring it into Photoshop or Lightroom and you can fix it yourself. It just takes a little bit more work doing it with Ektar 100. And sometimes it's easier just to stick with a Portra 160 if you want that low ISO and clean look. And you're going to get much better colors as far as like for skin tones. Film has grain. It is what it is. Accept it. You either love the look or you don't. If you don't want grain, shoot digital, shoot a low ISO. Other than that, shoot a slide film or shoot Ektar 100. But you got to accept some grain as far as when you're shooting film. So if you're looking just for colors and saturation and contrast and certain looks, and you want to shoot landscapes, Ektar 100. I personally love Ultramax and Portra 800 for landscapes. I just find the colors coming out of those film stocks are incredible. Portra 400 as well in certain situations. So yeah, that's my quick beginner's guide on film stocks and which films you might want to choose or consider when starting your film photography journey. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. If you want me to make another video or go in more depth in another video, I can do that as well. Also leave that in the comments and let me know if you want me to kind of expand on anything. But yeah, if you like what you saw, feel free to stick around and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.